The rain pounded against the windshield as the billionaire gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had followed her into the darkest slums of the city, expecting to uncover a greedy thief. Instead, what waited behind that rotting warehouse door would shatter his cold heart into 1,000,000 pieces. Arthur Kingsley lived a life insulated by impenetrable wealth. At 42, the software magnate had amassed a fortune that rivaled small nations residing alone in a sprawling 25-room estate nestled deep in the hills above Seattle. His world was one of glass, steel, and silent obedience. He trusted no one, a survival trait he had honed during a ruthless climb from a broken foster care system to the very pinnacle of the tech industry. Every employee who walked through his massive oak doors was thoroughly vetted, bonded, and watched by an intricate network of security cameras. Yet despite his fortress of paranoia, something inside his home was bleeding away. It started with small, almost imperceptible discrepancies. Arthur's relentless estate manager, an uncompromising woman named Mrs. Gable, was the first to bring it to his attention. She stood in his sprawling mahogany study, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Gourmet meals left over from Arthur's lavish corporate dinners were vanishing from the walk-in refrigerators. High-end Egyptian cotton blankets intended for the guest wing were disappearing from the laundry rotation. Then, more alarmingly, premium first aid supplies, burn creams, industrial bandages, and expensive antibiotics kept in the estate's emergency dispensary went missing. Mrs. Gable did not hesitate to point the finger. Her suspect was Naomi Caldwell. Naomi was a black woman in her late 30s who had been hired 8 months prior to manage the evening housekeeping shifts. She was a striking woman with deep, warm brown skin and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world, yet she moved through the Kingsley estate with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She never engaged in the idle gossip of the other staff. She scrubbed the marble floors until they gleamed, polished the chandeliers with meticulous care, and always vanished the very second her shift concluded at 10 o'clock at night. Arthur had barely spoken 2 words to her during her tenure, but he had noticed her. He noticed how her hands were always chapped from harsh chemicals, and how she wore a faded, oversized wool coat that offered no real protection against the biting Washington winters. "I have checked the security logs, mister." Kingsley, Mrs. Gable had said, her voice dripping with venomous certainty. "Every time items go unaccounted for, it correlates perfectly with Naomi's shift. She is stealing from you. I recommend immediate termination and a call to the Seattle Police Department." Arthur had leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the glowing monitors on his desk. He despised thieves. He despised the idea that someone was smiling to his face while picking his pockets in the shadows. But Arthur was not a man who handed his problems over to the police without airtight proof. He wanted to know exactly what Naomi was doing with his property. Was she fencing the expensive blankets? Was she selling the antibiotics on the black market? He needed to see the betrayal with his own eyes. "Say nothing to her," Arthur commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I will handle Ms. Caldwell." The opportunity presented itself on a freezing Tuesday night in late November. A torrential downpour was hammering the Pacific Northwest, turning the winding roads of the estate into slick, treacherous rivers. Arthur sat in his darkened study, his eyes locked on the live feed of the service entrance. At exactly 10:02 p.m., the heavy steel door creaked open. Naomi stepped out into the freezing deluge. She pulled the collar of her threadbare coat up around her neck, shivering violently as the icy rain immediately soaked her hair. But what caught Arthur's attention was the heavy, olive-green canvas duffel bag slung over her right shoulder. It was noticeably swollen, bulging with unseen cargo. She struggled beneath its weight, her boots slipping on the wet cobblestones, as she hurried down the service driveway toward the main road. Arthur's jaw tightened. He felt a cold surge of vindication mixed with a strange, bitter disappointment. There it is, he thought. The proof. Grabbing the keys to his unmarked black SUV, a vehicle he kept specifically to blend in, completely distinct from his usual fleet of recognizable sports cars, Arthur slipped out through the garage. He killed the headlights as he rolled down the winding driveway, keeping a safe distance behind the lone figure, trudging through the storm. Naomi did not wait for the estate's private shuttle. Instead, she walked a grueling mile in the blinding rain to the nearest public bus stop on the edge of the wealthy district. Arthur parked his SUV in the shadows of a towering cedar tree, watching her through the rhythmic sweeping of his windshield wipers. She sat on the wet metal bench, hugging the duffel bag to her chest, as if protecting a newborn child. Her shoulders shook with the cold. When the late-night city bus finally hissed to a stop, Naomi climbed aboard. Arthur pulled out into the street, maintaining a careful distance of 3 car lengths. As they drove away from the manicured lawns and gated driveways of the elite, the cityscape began to shift. The glittering towers of downtown Seattle faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the grim industrial decay of the Sodo district. Here the streetlights were shattered. Graffiti scarred the crumbling brick facades of abandoned manufacturing plants, and the sidewalks were littered with the debris of forgotten lives. Arthur felt a knot of genuine apprehension tighten in his stomach. This was a dangerous place. Even the police rarely patrolled these blocks past midnight. What business did a quiet housekeeper have in the most violent, neglected artery of the city? The bus groaned to a halt at a dark intersection. Naomi stepped off into ankle-deep puddles. Arthur pulled his SUV into an abandoned gas station lot, turning off the engine. From here, he would have to follow her on foot. He pulled up the collar of his designer trench coat, stepping out into the freezing rain, his heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against his ribs as he prepared to confront the woman who had dared to steal from him. The icy rain felt like needles against Arthur's face as he trailed 50 yards behind Naomi. The streets were eerily desolate, save for the occasional feral cat darting between overflowing dumpsters. The stench of rotting garbage and stagnant water hung heavy in the damp air. Arthur's handmade Italian leather shoes, completely unsuited for the treacherous terrain, soaked through within minutes. He cursed under his breath, wondering if this ridiculous pursuit was worth the handful of stolen blankets and leftover catering. But it was no longer about the money. It was about the mystery. Naomi moved with a desperate, hurried purpose. Despite the crushing weight of the duffel bag, she didn't stop to rest. She navigated the labyrinth of dark, broken alleyways with the practiced ease of someone who walked this dangerous path every single night. At one point, a group of shadowy figures huddled around a flaming trash can shouted out at her. Arthur instinctively reached into his coat, his hand wrapping around the cold steel of his permitted firearm. But Naomi simply lowered her head, quickened her pace, and melted deeper into the shadows without looking back. Finally she stopped. Arthur pressed himself against the cold, wet brick of a derelict auto shop, holding his breath as he peered around the corner. Before them stood the Oakhaven Mill, a massive condemned textile factory that had been boarded up for nearly a decade. Its windows were shattered, gaping like black, jagged teeth against the night sky. A chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire surrounded the perimeter, but Naomi pushed aside a section of the fencing that had been carefully cut and rolled back. She squeezed through the gap and approached a heavy steel side door. Looking over her shoulder one last time, Arthur quickly pulled his head back. She tapped a distinct rhythm on the metal. Tap, 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 tap. A heavy deadbolt clacked loudly, echoing in the rain. The door opened just a crack, and Naomi slipped inside. Arthur waited a full minute, the freezing rain seeping through his expensive coat, chilling him to the bone. He stepped out from his hiding place and approached the perimeter. He squeezed through the same gap in the fence, the rusted metal tearing a long gash in his sleeve. He ignored the ruin of his clothing. His mind was racing with dark possibilities. Was this a chop shop? A fencing operation for stolen luxury goods? An illegal gambling den? He reached the heavy steel door. It hadn't fully latched. Taking a slow, deep breath, Arthur curled his fingers around the cold, wet edge of the metal and pulled it open just enough to slip inside. The interior of the factory was swallowed by pitch darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, old oil, and something else, something distinctly sterile, the faint scent of antiseptic. Arthur moved silently, his steps muffled by years of accumulated dust and debris on the concrete floor. Ahead of him, a faint, flickering yellow glow spilled from a hallway, leading deeper into the cavernous building. He followed the light, navigating past rusted machinery and collapsed support beams. As he drew closer, a strange, low hum of noise reached his ears. It wasn't the aggressive shouts of a criminal enterprise. It was the sound of hushed voices. A soft cough, the distinct rattling wheeze of someone struggling to draw breath. Arthur crept to the edge of the hallway, where the concrete wall gave way to a massive open factory floor. He hid behind a towering iron pillar, slowly leaning out to look into the illuminated space. What he saw struck him with the force of a physical blow. The vast room was not a den of thieves. It was a makeshift underground hospital ward. Dozens of cots, cheap mattresses, and even layers of cardboard were laid out in neat, organized rows across the factory floor. The space was illuminated by a network of battery-powered camping lanterns. Laying on those beds were the most broken, vulnerable people Arthur had ever seen. Elderly men and women, frail and shivering, young children with hollow cheeks, people with terrible, untreated injuries. And moving among them like a beacon of desperate grace was Naomi. Arthur watched in stunned silence as she unzipped the heavy green duffel bag. First, she pulled out the thick Egyptian cotton blankets missing from his estate. She knelt beside an elderly woman who was violently shaking from the damp cold, gently wrapping the luxurious fabric around the woman's frail shoulders, whispering soft, comforting words. Next, Naomi pulled out the plastic containers of gourmet food filet mignon, roasted vegetables, artisanal bread that had been destined for Arthur's trash. She handed them to a group of emaciated teenagers who received the food with tears in their eyes. Arthur's chest tightened, a strange, painful lump forming in his throat. He watched as Naomi pulled out the stolen medical supplies. She moved to a cot where a young boy lay pale and sweating. Using the high-end antibiotics and burn creams from the Kingsley estate, she meticulously cleaned and dressed a severe infection on the child's leg. But it was when Naomi walked toward the far corner of the room that Arthur felt his heart stop entirely. There, sitting in a battered wheelchair, was a man hooked up to a rudimentary battery-operated oxygen concentrator. The man's face was sunken, his body ravaged by advanced disease. But as Naomi approached, a weak, loving smile spread across his lips. Naomi knelt before the wheelchair, pressing her forehead against the man's hands. She was crying. Arthur stared at the man in the wheelchair, his mind spinning, trying to place the face. And then, the horrifying realization crashed down upon him. 2 years ago, Arthur's corporation, Kingsley Medical Tech, had aggressively bought out the land beneath Harborview Charity Clinic, the only free medical facility in the Sodo district. Arthur had ordered the building demolished to make way for a state-of-the-art data server farm, displacing hundreds of desperate patients who had nowhere else to go. Naomi wasn't a thief. She was the sole exhausted lifeline for the very people Arthur Kingsley had carelessly thrown away. Arthur stood paralyzed behind the rusted iron pillar. The cold that had seeped into his bones from the freezing Seattle rain was completely eclipsed by the icy grip of profound, suffocating guilt. He could not tear his eyes away from the man in the battered wheelchair. Naomi knelt beside him, her hands gently framing his gaunt face. "I'm here, David," she whispered, her voice carrying over the low hum of the dying oxygen concentrator. "I brought you the good blankets tonight, and actual food. You need to eat my love." David Caldwell reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the luxurious Egyptian cotton Arthur had begrudged losing. "You shouldn't take such risks, Naomi." David rasped, his breathing terribly shallow. "If they catch you, if that billionaire monster finds out." Arthur flinched, as if he had been physically struck. That billionaire monster. The words echoed in the cavernous expanse of the abandoned Oakhaven mill. He closed his eyes, and suddenly the grim reality of the warehouse faded, replaced by the sterile, blinding lights of his corporate boardroom 2 years ago. He remembered the crisp-tailored suits of his executives. He remembered sipping a $50 glass of scotch as he callously signed the demolition orders for the Sodo district block. "The Harborview Charity Clinic is a fiscal black hole," his chief financial officer had argued that day. "The land value is astronomical, Arthur. If we bulldoze the clinic and the surrounding low-income housing, we can build the largest automated server farm on the West Coast. The displacement of the current demographic is a municipal problem, not ours." Arthur had signed the paper without a second thought, effectively sentencing hundreds of vulnerable people to the unforgiving streets. He had chased a 7% bump in his quarterly stock valuation, and in return, he had destroyed the lives of the very people sleeping on damp cardboard mere feet away from him. Naomi, a woman who scrubbed his marble floors to the bone, was desperately trying to patch up the bleeding wounds his corporate empire had inflicted. Unable to watch any longer, Arthur stepped backward, his soaked Italian leather shoes making no sound. He slipped out of the heavy steel door and back into the relentless Pacific Northwest storm. The rain hid the tears that had suddenly inexplicably begun to stream down his face. The drive back to the sprawling Kingsley estate was a blur. When Arthur finally pulled his unmarked SUV into the 6-car garage, the silence of his 25-room mansion felt entirely different. It no longer felt like a sanctuary of success. It felt like a tomb. He walked through the echoing empty halls, his wet trench coat leaving a trail of water on the pristine hardwood floors. He looked at the extravagant crystal chandeliers, the imported statues, the priceless abstract paintings. It all looked repulsive to him now. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his mahogany study, staring at the security monitors, waiting for the sun to rise over the Washington Hills. At exactly 7 a.m., a sharp knock broke the silence of the estate. Mrs. Gable, the rigid and unforgiving estate manager, marched into the study. She was not alone. Behind her stood 2 uniformed officers from the Seattle Police Department, their radios crackling softly in the quiet room. "Good morning, Mr. Kingsley," Mrs. Gable said, a triumphant smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I took the liberty of contacting the authorities. I conducted a thorough inventory of the medical dispensary this morning. Entire boxes of premium burn salves and oral antibiotics are missing. Ms. Caldwell's shift ended at 10 last night. The evidence is irrefutable. I have asked Officers Jenkins and Miller to be present to arrest her when she arrives for her shift tonight." Arthur slowly stood from his leather chair. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. He looked at the police officers who suddenly seemed very uncomfortable under his piercing gaze, and then he turned his eyes to Mrs. Gable. "Officers," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low and dangerously calm, "there has been a severe misunderstanding. No property has been stolen from this estate." Mrs. Gable blinked, her smirk vanishing instantly. "Sir, I have the inventory logs right here. She is a thief. We must make an example of her. Ms. Caldwell was acting under my direct, explicit orders. Arthur interrupted, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Every blanket, every meal, every bandage she removed from this property was authorized by me. She is managing a private, philanthropic project on my behalf. But, sir, the security logs— Mrs. Gable stammered, her face flushing crimson. The only person in this room who has overstepped their boundaries is you, Mrs. Gable, Arthur said, stepping around his massive desk. You are fired, effective immediately. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you are still on my property at 8:15, I will have these fine officers arrest you for trespassing. Mrs. Gable stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped fish before she finally turned and practically fled the study. Arthur thanked the confused police officers, escorted them to the door and locked it behind them. He didn't have a second to waste. He walked back to his desk, picked up his private phone, and dialed a number he rarely used. He called Dr. Benjamin Olcott, the chief of medicine at the prestigious Swedish medical center, a man whose research department Arthur solely funded. Ben, Arthur said the moment the doctor answered. I need your best trauma surgeons, your best respiratory specialists, and 3 fully equipped mobile triage units. Cancel whatever you have today. I don't care what it costs. We have a lot of lives to save tonight. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the Seattle air sharp, frigid, and biting. At 10:30 p.m., the desolate streets of the Sodo district were suddenly illuminated by a blinding procession of high beams. 3 massive state-of-the-art mobile medical units from Kingsley Medical Tech rolled over the cracked asphalt, accompanied by a fleet of black luxury SUVs. The convoy came to a halt right outside the rusted razor-wire perimeter of the Oakhaven Mill. Inside the warehouse, panic erupted. Naomi had just finished distributing a new batch of hot soup she had purchased with her meager wages, when the heavy hum of diesel engines and the flashing of bright lights pierced the boarded-up windows. The patients inside began to cry out in terror. It's a raid, one of the younger men shouted, scrambling to his feet. The city is clearing us out. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. She rushed to the heavy steel door, throwing her weight against it, frantically trying to slide the heavy metal deadbolt into place. She knew this day would come. She knew the city would not tolerate their makeshift sanctuary forever. Everyone stay back, she yelled, her voice cracking with fear. David, stay in your chair. Before she could lock the deadbolt, the door was firmly pushed open from the outside. Naomi stumbled back, grabbing a heavy rusted wrench from a nearby workbench, fully prepared to fight the police to the bitter end to protect her husband and these vulnerable people. But it wasn't the police who stepped through the door. It was Arthur Kingsley. He wore a simple dark sweater, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Behind him, Naomi could see dozens of people in white coats and scrubs, carrying stretchers, oxygen tanks, and advanced medical equipment. Naomi dropped the wrench, her eyes widening in absolute horror. She recognized the billionaire immediately. She had polished the silver frames holding his magazine covers. He knows, she thought, panic seizing her throat. He followed me. He's here to arrest me for stealing. Mr. Kingsley, please, Naomi begged, stepping in front of David's wheelchair, using her own body as a shield. Tears spilled over her cheeks. I'll give it all back. I'll work for free for the rest of my life. Put me in jail, do whatever you want to me, but please, I am begging you, do not hurt them. They have nothing. They have nowhere to go. Arthur stopped 10 feet away from her. The imposing, ruthless tech titan looked at the terrified black maid, and his imposing facade shattered completely. Right there in the middle of the filthy, freezing warehouse, Arthur Kingsley dropped to his knees. A stunned silence fell over the massive room. The murmurs of the sick and injured ceased. David stared in disbelief from his wheelchair. "You don't owe me anything, Naomi," Arthur said, his voice breaking, tears shining in his eyes. "I owe you everything. I owe all of you. My entire life." He looked around the room, meeting the terrified eyes of the people his corporate greed had displaced. "2 years ago, my company destroyed the Harborview Clinic. I signed the paper. I tore down your safe haven so I could build a computer farm. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I chased money while you—" He looked back up at Naomi, his voice thick with emotion. "While you gave everything you had to clean up my sins. You aren't a thief, Naomi. You are the only decent human being I have ever known." Naomi stood frozen, processing the impossible reality unfolding in front of her. The untouchable billionaire was crying at her feet. Arthur stood up, slowly, wiping his face. He gestured to the medical teams waiting outside the door. "Dr. Alcott, bring them in." The warehouse was instantly transformed. Highly trained nurses and doctors flooded the space. Advanced heated cots were set up. Dr. Alcott personally rushed to David's side, hooking him up to a clinical-grade oxygen ventilator and administering proper, life-saving intravenous medication. For the first time in 2 years, David took a full, deep breath without wheezing, a look of profound relief washing over his tired face. Naomi watched, trembling, as the medical professionals treated the infections, the broken bones, and the severe malnutrition of her makeshift family. Arthur walked up to her, holding out a pristine legal document. "What is this?" Naomi whispered, wiping her tears. "It's a transfer of deed," Arthur said softly. "I bought the abandoned corporate campus 3 blocks from here. Tomorrow morning construction begins. We are building a new hospital. Not a clinic, a state-of-the-art, fully funded hospital, and I want you to be the executive director of patient care." Naomi looked at the paper, then up at Arthur. "I'm a housekeeper, Mr. Kingsley. I don't have a medical degree." Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm smile that finally reached his eyes. "You have something a degree can't teach, Naomi. You have a heart that refused to give up on people the world threw away. You are exactly who should be running it." 6 months later, the doors of the Caldwell Kingsley Hope Center officially opened. It was a beacon of light in the Sodo district, offering free, world-class medical care to anyone who walked through its doors. David Caldwell, fully recovered and breathing easily, stood proudly by his wife's side as she cut the ceremonial ribbon. Arthur Kingsley stood in the background, no longer the lonely, paranoid billionaire in a glass tower, but a man who had finally learned what it truly meant to be wealthy. The truth about Naomi's secret life completely transformed Arthur's cold heart. Instead of punishing her, the billionaire used his vast fortune to build a state-of-the-art charity hospital, giving back the very lives he had once carelessly destroyed. Sometimes true wealth isn't measured by the money you hoard, but by the broken people you help heal. If this real-life drama touched your soul, please hit the like button, share it to spread hope, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.